Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me today. It's great to have all of you here. We've got about 85, 90 people joining so far, so that's fantastic. So my name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer. I'm a printmaker, teacher, and I'm also honored to be a Canson Infinity Ambassador since 2011 now. And so on behalf of Canson Infinity, I'm happy to welcome you to this presentation that I'll be sharing today called Mastering the Print Process. Now, to be completely transparent, you probably won't master the print process by the end of this webinar, but that's a good thing actually. For me, mastery isn't a destination. It's not a state of being. It's a process of growth and discovery. It's trying new things, it's learning, it's growing. And for me, that's what mastery is all about. It's a commitment to long-term results, particularly in today's world where we seem to be very focused on short-term gratification, but creativity, art, mastery in general is something that comes when you apply yourself on a regular basis. The results come naturally. So what I'm going to share with you today are some fundamentals of printing, both from a creative perspective and also from technical side, of course, because there's a lot of technical stuff going on under the hood when it comes to digital printing. But well, all of this so that you can build a strong foundation in for your own printing, regardless of whether you're starting out or even if you've been doing this for a while. The fundamentals, the principles are always important to continue to revisit. So this is based on my own experience of printing and exhibiting my work for over 15 years in many different venues, galleries, exhibitions, as well as teaching workshops, many workshops over the years and working with lots of other students. This is not the only way to approach printing. There are many other approaches out there, but for me, it's the one that prioritizes creativity, personal expression, and using the tools in the most efficient and effective way possible. For me, I want to leave enough mental bandwidth in my head, in my brain, for the creative side so that I don't get bogged down with the technical. And that means keeping things simple, using the least amount of tools to achieve the best results. And of course, that includes a wonderful paper from Canson. So before I get started, just a few things. Please feel free to leave your questions in the question area. Yes, there will be a recording available. Laszlo, thanks for that question. There'll be a recording available, and you can leave your questions there, and I will address them as I go through the presentation. I'll stop periodically to see if there are any questions that are relevant to what I'm talking about and address them there. And I'll also try to leave a Q&A section at the end in case you have any more questions. Okay, so with that said, let's get started. So I want to start with a quote, which is my favorite quote by Ansel Adams. The negative is the score, the print is the performance. And that's one of the fundamental ideas that I use, that I base my printing on, which is that printing is the performance of your image. It is the next step, the next artistic expression. It's not just putting a print on a piece of paper. It is its own medium, its own product that you produce to express your vision with the world. Now, many of you may be printing already, but even if perhaps you're on the fence or you're not sure, maybe you're exploring this area, let me just go through a few reasons why I think printing is such a fundamental part of my photography and why it can be a part of yours, in addition to the Ansel Adams quote before. First of all, it's a physical, tangible experience that you bring into the world based on your digital photography. And, we're all surrounded by screens and displays. This is something you can hold in your hand. And for me, that's something that just can't be replaced with anything else. Second, it's a finished medium that doesn't change from device to device. So if you make a print at a certain size, with a certain paper, that's the impression that viewers will get, the interpretation on that medium, not the way an image can change, again, depending on how you're looking at it digitally. You have more opportunities for interpretation and for experimentation, of course, because you can change the paper to change the perception that people will get of your image. Again, that's the performance part of printing, which I think is so wonderful from a creative standpoint. And then finally, I think when you show your images to someone on an iPad or an iPhone, or you send them a link, that's kind of normal. That's how everyone is sharing their images. But if you hand somebody a print and they hold it in their hands, that's a total different experience. It conveys a sense of your commitment to your craft, to your artistic expression. And again, there's nothing I think that can replace that beyond making your own prints. Now, part of making prints is understanding what is a good print, what constitutes a good print. How do we define? How do you define? How do you know when you have a print that is working, that is the best you can make? And so let's go through some of these aesthetics. First is, at the bare minimum, you want a print that has enough resolution. That means that the file that you're printing has enough information so that you generate a good looking print. And I'll go over some of these technical aspects later. But also that the print reproduces detail where the viewer expects to see detail. And also that it is aesthetically sharp. Aesthetically sharp means that you're not sharpening the entire image throughout. You are sharpening the parts of the image that need more sharpening, that are closer to the viewer or that are around your center of interest. And you're letting other parts of the image remain a little bit softer. That doesn't mean that it's soft. It just means that it's not as sharp as the main area. So in this image here, I am really focusing on sharpening this part of the image here. That's where I focus most of my sharpening. And then this area down here gets less sharpening, and this area back here gets less sharpening. The reason for that, again, is because I want the viewer to focus on the main center of interest, which is here, and let this area recede back into the distance. And because our eyes are more sensitive to areas that are sharper, that creates or produces the illusion of depth. It gives your image your print more dimension. And of course, a print is an approximation of the real world, but a very poor one at that. And so this just makes your print look and feel more dimensional. The next thing is your print should have enough density and shadow separation. That has to do with the blacks. This is dependent on the image that you want to print. So depending on your image, if you need to have those blacks and that shadow separation, the print should have that. You should also have what I'm calling smoothness of tonal gradation. So in this example here, I would like to make a print on paper that allows the shadows in this area to remain visible or open. In other words, I don't want that to go completely black. I want that to remain something that can still be explored. And that requires that the image be optimized properly, and I use the proper paper to maintain that depth in the shadows. And gradations is this here. That's a gradation from a darker area to a lighter area. You want that to be really smooth. You want that to be free of any artifacts, things like banding, anything that would produce a distraction on the print. Again, that's a function of the quality of your image and the quality of the paper that can produce those beautiful transitions between colors or between tones. And then finally, you want luminosity of the midtones, and you want an image that is absent of artifacts. Luminosity of midtones means that the image is open enough, that the image doesn't feel too dark. One of the biggest complaints that I hear students make is that their images are too dark. They're not as bright as the monitor, and that has to do with certain aspects, but one of them is not opening up your midtones enough in your image. So when I make this print here, this area here, I really want this area to feel open and not too dark, because that maintains the luminosity of the print, which of course preserves the luminosity in the original image. And then things like artifacts are You have to be careful with sensor dust, uh, little objects in your image that you may not notice if you make a small print, but if you make a large print, those things become much more obvious. Particularly sensor dust is one of those things where I've made an 8.5 by 11 print, didn't notice the sensor dust, and then I made one 13 by 19 or larger, and now it was a problem. So those are the things that you want to be careful with. Again, working towards producing excellent prints. And then finally, paper is the final and the ultimate factor in the perception of a print. And that really has to do with the story that you want to tell, because the paper can define whether your print feels loud and aggressive or whether your print looks and feels less loud, right? More quiet, more softer, maybe painterly even. And so the paper is going to translate your image again from the performance perspective. It's going to translate your image in different ways, and understanding how the paper works is going to allow you to make a better print. This is where Canson's papers really come into their own for me and for many others that I know that use them. They offer a wide range of finishes and textures, and they all preserve the color and the detail in your image. So I don't have to worry about one paper losing a little bit of detail because it's a matte paper. They all will preserve whatever is in my original image, but they allow me to add, to complement my image with the characteristics of the paper. And so each paper allows me to produce a different interpretation. Again, as Ansel would say, a different performance. I love that, again, they have different surfaces and finishes that have different applications. They come in a wide variety of sizes, and really important, Canson produces and offers great ICC profiles. These are the profiles that you're going to need to print on your printer so that you get accurate color, and the better the quality of the profile, the better the result you're going to get. Now, you can make your own profiles, of course, but if a manufacturer offers free profiles that are actually good quality, that gets you up and running much faster with much less frustration. Again, that's one of the things I really like about Canson papers. Now, I've been lucky enough to visit the mill in France. So what I love about Canson is that they're dedicated to paper making. They've been making papers since the mid 1500s, not digital papers, but they've been making fine art papers, and only recently in the last 15 years decided to make digital papers. But they carry this long heritage and commitment and dedication to printmaking expertise into their digital papers. They have their own mill, which means they make their own papers from scratch, not the same that you can't say the same about many other manufacturers who outsource their paper manufacturing. Canson papers don't use any OBAs, which are optical brighteners that have a tendency to degrade the paper over time and will degrade unevenly. So you may not know what your print will look like in 15, 20 years if permanence is something that you're thinking about. And as I mentioned before, great quality profiles. So I want to talk a little bit about selecting papers. And everything I've been discussing so far rests on an approach that I use called the image-centric approach. Now, what is the image-centric approach? Well, I think one of the more common or perhaps intuitive ways to selecting a paper is the paper-centric approach. That means that you look at different papers, perhaps from different manufacturers. You think about a paper that you think you like, and then maybe there's two papers that you choose, and you print all of your images onto those two papers. And so again, this implies that most of all of your images are going to be printed on that paper. So that's one approach. The second approach, the one that I use and that I recommend and that I suggest, is the image-centric approach. So instead of finding one paper that works best for your images, or even a paper that's best for black and white, or a paper that's best for landscapes, you evaluate each of your images based on what you're trying to convey, and you choose a paper that best complements that vision. Now, you can divide all papers, regardless of the manufacturer. I'm showing you Canson papers here. You can divide all papers into two broad categories: matte papers and non-matte papers. And the biggest difference, aside from texture and the finish, the biggest difference is going to be the Dmax. Dmax is a measurement of how much black a paper can hold. Matte papers tend to hold less Dmax. Non-matte papers, and that is going to be anything like platine or a baryta or a fiber, luster, satin, any paper that has a shiny surface is going to hold more black and more Dmax. And so Dmax, matte and non-matte, is going to give you the biggest difference in terms of how a print looks and the perception of that print. Matte papers are, as I said before, usually have less, or not usually, almost always have less Dmax. They have variable texture, so you get more options in texture, and they offer, from an artistic aesthetic standpoint, a softer, more nuanced feel. Some people call this painterly. Maybe you can call it less photographic, but this is the prime quality, the beautiful quality behind matte papers, is that they give you this more of a fine art look. And because they have different amounts of texture, you can use that texture to complement the texture in your image. Canson's papers, even though they are matte papers, they still give you a great amount of Dmax, so you don't really have to worry too much about losing the contrast in your image. But you do get that quality of a matte paper, the characteristics of a matte paper. So for me, I have no hesitation in choosing a matte paper for a landscape image that has lots of detail, that has lots of darks in it, because perhaps I want to emphasize the color and the softness of the moment and offer a more painterly look and feel instead of something that's very loud and aggressive, something that's a little bit more nuanced. And so here I'm using Rag Photographique to print this image, and that's a matte paper. Now, non-matte papers give you the maximum amount of Dmax. So Dmax, again, how much black they hold. They're going to give you the maximum amount of contrast. They usually have a smoother surface, and they're going to give you a louder, more aggressive look and feel. More photographic, you can call it that. And these papers are papers like Platine, Baryta, Baryta Prestige, and even the RC papers, which they're not fine art papers. They're what we call resin-coated papers, but they also give you more Dmax. And these papers are a great choice when perhaps maximum contrast is what you want, a more photographic look. Maybe you need to have a lot of separation in the shadows, more than you're going to get with a matte paper. And so you choose one of these papers, even though you know that it's going to be very aggressive. Maybe that's the look that you're going for, and that's perfectly fine with that. The whole point behind matte, non-matte, high Dmax, low Dmax is that there isn't any right or wrong. These are artistic choices that you get to make depending on what you want your print to say, to convey to others. So creative vision is part of the print of the paper selection process. Once you start to think about prints as or paper, I should say, as an aesthetic combination, when you think about prints as an aesthetic combination of the paper and the image, then you have a much better sense of which paper is best for you. And in this case, I'm using a Baryta paper for this image because I wanted stronger contrast. I wanted to really project the darks and the blacks in this image. Even though it's a black and white image, that's not necessarily why I picked a high Dmax paper. It just happens to be the case that the image itself dictated to me that I use a high Dmax paper. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to use or try all the papers that Canson or anybody else has to offer, because your images are probably going to have a certain look and feel to them, like mine's do. And so for the kind of work that I do, for the kind of images that I make, I tend to gravitate towards just 3 or 4 papers that I use over and over and over again. I don't need or want a lot of texture. I prefer matte papers that have a very smooth finish or maybe a light texture, something like BFK Reeves, or maybe no texture like RC88. But those papers give me that softer, painterly look to an image that I really like, because that's what I'm bringing in terms of what I want to convey to the viewer. And when I want something a little more aggressive, I have richer shadows, strong blacks, then I use either something like a Platine, which has a slight sort of grain on the surface, And then I use Brita as well, which is very, very smooth and gives me all the darks that I could ever want. And so between these 3 or 4 papers, I can pretty much cover every image that I'm going to print until I decide that I want to change my style completely, and then I can try some other kind of paper. But I really don't have to stock all 14 or 15 papers. I really just stock 3 or 4 papers. But getting to this stage meant that I tried different things and I thought about my uh, approach and I thought about what I'm trying to achieve with my work. Okay, a couple questions about getting the profiles to show up in Lightroom. I will discuss Lightroom towards the end and I'll show you a workflow in Lightroom. So I'll talk about how to get the profiles into Lightroom. Let me discuss a little bit about color management and some of the technical aspects here, just to familiarize yourself with a few things. Color management is about getting our file into the computer, editing the image, and then outputting it out to the printer. And for this, we need what are called ICC profiles, because profiles translate between one device and another. So you notice in this graphic here that I have a profile between the camera and the computer, and that's the profile that Lightroom uses to render your raw file. And that profile is built into Lightroom. There's another profile for your monitor, and that profile is generated when you calibrate your monitor. Again, making sure that the colors that Lightroom is producing are the colors that you accurately see on your monitor. And then there's a final profile here that is the profile you need in order to make sure that when you send your file to the printer, that the printer uses the appropriate colors for that specific paper. So what's important here is that you don't select a profile for your printer, you select a profile for the paper that you're going to use, and the printer just follows the instructions. That's very key here. Every paper has its own profile because every paper has a different characteristic in terms of what colors it can produce, called the gamut, and how much black it can produce, again, because whether it's a matte paper or a non-matte paper. Now let's talk about resolution a little bit. This is another one of those extremely convoluted topics that many people confuse, and I just want to clear up a few things here so you're clear about resolution. So first and foremost, resolution in its basic broad terms is a function of how finely divided your something is. And so if you think of this as a camera sensor, the higher the resolution, the more pixels you have because it's divided into finer parts. So high resolution means smaller division of the whole. Less resolution is larger division of the whole, meaning less fidelity. Now, there are also other ways to talk about resolution, and I'm going to list now 3 or 4 different ways, but these are all related to printing. So as I mentioned a minute ago, you have the native resolution of your camera sensor. So this is simply a function of how many pixels your camera is producing. And typically this is given in, like 6,000 megapixels, 8,000 megapixels, 20, whatever the case may be, but it's a function of pixels. And this is fixed. It's based on your camera, and that's all it is, just pixels. Now there's a second way of talking about resolution, which is PPI. And PPI stands for pixels per inch. And this is a function of how you're going to distribute the pixels that come from your camera onto a piece of paper. How many pixels you're going to put per inch of paper. And so PPI is printer or print specific. PPI only comes up when we're talking about prints because paper is basically measured in inches, and we have to decide again how to distribute the pixels onto the paper. There's also DPI, and DPI is not the same as PPI. DPI stands for dots per inch, and DPI is a function of the resolution or quality output of your printer, because a printer doesn't print pixels, a printer prints dots. Those are the physical dots that come out of the print head, and the printer uses multiple dots to make each pixel. And so on a printer, you may see numbers like 600 dpi, or if it's an Epson, you'll see 2880 dpi. That just means how many dots the printer is going to use to print your image. That has nothing to do with the PPI. In other words, you can send an image to the printer at different PPI settings, and the printer will always print at the same resolution based on what you set the printer at. And I always suggest that you set the printer at the highest resolution, because why wouldn't you want your printer to print at the highest resolution? Okay, so there's PPI and DPI, which has to do with printing. It's print specific, and PPI and DPI is only relevant when you're printing. And then there's the pixel resolution of your image, which is only relevant when you're not printing, particularly if you're sharing your images online, if you're putting them on your iPad or your iPhone or on the web. PPI and DPI are irrelevant because you're staying in the digital format. It's only when you go to paper that PPI and DPI come into play. Now, there's one last kind of resolution, or another way that resolution is applied, and that is the native resolution that all printers print at. What this means is that whether you have an Epson or a Canon, it has a native resolution for its print head, which means that regardless of what file you send to the printer, it is going to interpolate that file to print at the printer's native resolution. For Canon, this happens to be 300 ppi. For Epson, it's 360 ppi. So again, if you send a file to an Epson printer at 200 ppi, it's going to interpolate it up to 360 to print, because that's the native resolution of the printer. Now, it just so happens that this interpolation takes place in the printer, but you can also do this interpolation in Lightroom. And the interpolation in Lightroom is better quality. It's going to give you a better interpolation. Interpolation is another word for interpolation is upscaling or downscaling, but typically we're upscaling. The interpolation in Lightroom is a better quality than what's going to be in your printer. And also, Lightroom offers things like smart sharpening, meaning that if you're interpolating by a certain amount, it'll sharpen more or less depending on how far you're interpolating. And you can even add output sharpening for your print based on whether you're printing onto a matte or a non-matte paper. And I'll show you this when we get to Lightroom later, but I just wanted to show you that here so you can see where that is in the print module. So what does this mean? It means that if we are printing and we know that our printer has a native print resolution, then we can take advantage of Lightroom. And this is specific to Lightroom Classic. That's the app that I use to do all my printing, that I love to use. I think it's wonderful, and I always recommend you use from an efficiency and a simple standpoint. We can use the interpolation in Lightroom to make sure that we're sending the best possible file to the printer. So the first step is you lay out your print in Lightroom. So that means you select a paper size and you lay out your print, and Lightroom will tell you what the native resolution is for your print based on the paper size that you've chosen and your image. And your image is going to have a certain size, and then depending on the size that you choose, you're going to have a native resolution. So again, it depends on what paper size you choose, but it's going to tell you what the native resolution is. If your native resolution is less than 180 ppi, let's say you've got an image that is from a 16 megapixel camera and you're trying to print it at 30 by 40, your resolution is going to be low because that's a really large size print and you have a small file. It might be that your resolution is less than 180. Why 180? Because generally speaking, that tends to be the cutoff for when the quality degrades beyond it looking good on a print, particularly if you get up close to it, you can start to see pixelation. If it's less than 180, that means that you're trying to make too large a print for the image that you have, and you need to reduce the print size. So you need to go a little bit smaller so that you can raise the PPI. You can raise the pixels per inch. In other words, the smaller you make the print, the more pixels you have for each inch of that paper. Now, I say reduce the print size, but you might also upscale your image, which means you're going to make your image bigger, and that'll also give you some resolution. But generally speaking, if it's less than 180, then you need to reduce the print size. If it's whether you reduce the print size or not, let's say you have to reduce it. If it's now greater than 180, then the second step is it less than the printer native? So if you have an Epson printer, is the native resolution 360 or less? And if it's 360 or less, then you print that image and you use the interpolation in Lightroom to interpolate it to 360. In other words, you use the native resolution of the printer. So in this case, if I had an Epson, I would print it at 360. If I had a Canon, I would print it at 300. So this is in cases where you have more than 180, but you have equal or less than your printer's native resolution. And this is for all Epson and all Canon printers. It's Epson at 360 or Canon at 300. Now, there may be a situation where you have more than the printer's native resolution. Maybe you have a very large file. Maybe you've got a 30 or 40 megapixel camera and you're printing onto a smaller type paper, 8.5 by 11, 11 by 17. Well, your native resolution is going to be 4, 500, 600 PPI even. In that case, you don't want to print at the native resolution because you're actually going to wind up throwing away information. If your native resolution is 400 or 500 and you can printing on an Epson and you set it to 360, well, you're throwing away information there. So a better idea or a better process, and this has been shown through lots and lots of tests and experiments, is to print at double the printer's native resolution. So if your native resolution is 500 and you're printing onto an Epson, then you print at 720, which is double 360, and that will give you the best quality for that print that you're making. And the idea here is that the basis for this is that you don't want to throw information away, and so you're going to interpolate the image up to the easiest multiple, which is double the printer's native resolution. And I've used this technique for printing. It may look a little bit complex here, but it's actually pretty simple. I've used this for many, many, many years, many prints. I've always gotten fantastic results. And I will show you this when we get into Lightroom in a couple minutes. And then finally, last but not least, it is imperative that you calibrate your monitor or your monitors. And this is to make sure that you're actually seeing true colors on screen, that you're actually seeing the blacks and the whites that your monitor is capable of producing, that you have neutral color on screen, and very important, that you set your monitor brightness at a level that is appropriate for printing, because most monitors are too bright, and that's what causes in many cases, that's what causes your prints to look too dark, because you're going off what you see on screen. Your monitor is very bright, and then you make a print, and your print doesn't have the luminosity of an LCD screen. It relies on the light, natural light that you're putting on it, and so you wind up getting a print that's too dark because you're not really seeing properly on your monitor. So a good calibration will not only give you accurate colors and black and white points, but will give you also a measurement to set your monitor brightness where it should be. And typically it's about half of what you would think. It may seem a little dark at first, but you easily get adjusted to it, and you get much less eye fatigue working on your monitor when the level of the brightness level is much more reasonable, let's say. Okay, there's one question. What about Baryta matte paper from Jean Paul? Yes, I didn't mention Baryta matte there. Baryta matte is still less Dmax than regular Baryta, but it is very close. Baryta matte is one of my favorite papers because it really does push the limits of what you can achieve with a matte paper in terms of Dmax. It's almost as much as a non-matte paper. Not quite there, but really, really good. The best of any paper I've seen from anyone. So thanks for that. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to jump into Lightroom now. And I'm going to just walk you through a process here of printing an image. So here's my image here. I'm not going to walk you through the developing and editing. That would be a whole other webinar and discussion. But just to show you, here is the before and after. Go into the develop module here. There we go. So what's important to notice here is that I am optimizing the tones, meaning that I'm making sure that my brightest brights are somewhere in the picture. My darkest darks are somewhere in the picture. I'm opening up the midtones to make sure that I have lots of luminosity to really let that light into the image. And then I talked about aesthetic sharpening. I have more sharpening applied in these areas here and less sharpening back here. And that's, again, because this is closer to the viewer. I really want to create the biggest sense of depth in the image. Another thing to notice is that up here on the left-hand side, I've got some sensor dust. That's a big one, but there are lots of others in this image. I don't know if I see any right now. I may have taken them all out, but nonetheless, any sensor dust, even stuff that you really can't see on your screen sometimes, once you make a big print, that will be a big problem. Now, once I'm ready to make a print, I'm going to press S in the develop module, and that'll take me into the soft proof mode. S is for soft proofing, and the purpose of soft proofing is to compare my image, the original image, with the paper that I'm going to print on. So if I press Y on my keyboard, here's my original image, and then here's the image that is soft proofed for the paper that I want to print on. And you can come over here in Lightroom and you can select the paper you want to print on. I'm going to change the profile here to something like Arch 88. And you see that when I change it to Arch 88, the purpose here is to switch between the two rendering intents. You're going to select the rendering intent so that you get the best translation from the original to the paper. Remember, we're using a profile, and the profile has to translate the image. And there's two ways to do that: perceptual and relative. And you notice that when I click on perceptual or relative, relative looks a little brighter in the shadows. So I'm going to go with relative. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to tell, but the general rule of thumb is that if you can't really tell, then go with perceptual. That seems to work most of the time. So that's really what we're doing here. I'm not making many adjustments to the print in terms of color because the profile takes care of converting the colors for me. I might add a little bit of clarity to the image here. If I'm printing onto a matte paper, that just gives the image a little more bite, if you will, when I'm printing onto matte paper. And you'll notice that if I now come in here in the soft proof module and I adjust the clarity a little bit, so I'm going to push the clarity up to 30. As soon as I let go of my mouse, I get this window that asks me if I want to create a virtual copy for soft proofing. And I'm going to say yes, create virtual copy. And now when I go back to my library module, I have my original image and I have this version here that has been soft proofed for printing. In other words, it's a virtual copy that has that extra adjustment that I applied, which is a little bit more clarity. And if I press I on my keyboard to bring up the name of the image, you can see that it's added the name of the profile at the end of the name of the image, letting me know that I edited this image to print onto Arch 88 on my Epson P800. So this is the file that I would use for printing onto my Epson onto Arch 88. If I decided to print onto a different kind of paper and I made a slightly different adjustment, that I could create another soft proof or another virtual copy, or Lightroom would create one for me as soon as I made a little adjustment. So I'm going to select this version here, which is the one that we want to use to print with. I'm going to go into the print module. And let me just walk you through the basic adjustments, the basic settings here in the print module. First thing you want to do is click on page setup, and you want to select make sure you got the right printer. This is an Epson P800 that I'm using. I want to select the proper print size. I'm going to select 11 by 17. That's the paper that I have, the size that I have, and then I'm going to select the orientation here. And I hit OK. Then I'm going to come here on the right side and I'm just going to set my margins. So I'm going to set a margin of 1 inch all around. I want to make sure that I expand my cell size so that I'm making the print as large as it can be within the margins that I set. So now you can see that I have 1 inch left and right, and top and bottom is a little less because this image doesn't fit perfectly onto this size paper, but that's okay. I suggest you never leave, particularly if it's a print that you're going to matte or you're going to show or things like that. I never leave like a 1/4 inch on the edges because it's just not enough room. If you're going to matte it, you don't have a lot of room for matting, particularly if you want to show the paper. So I like to leave at least 3/4 of an inch to an inch all around so that the image floats inside the paper and I have a way of handling it or I have a place to sign it, etc. One other important thing here that you want to make sure in Lightroom is make sure you don't have zoom to fill checked. Because you see, if I check this, it's going to crop the image in to fit within the cell size. And that's not what I want because it's changing the crop in my image. It doesn't affect the original file. This is done virtually, but nonetheless, I want to uncheck this so that I'm printing my composition as it is. Then I'm going to come down here. Everything here, by the way, everything else here is some ways to add things to your image, etc. You can add identities and identity plate, or you can add labels, but we're just going to make a simple plain print. Very important here, show guides. We want to make sure that this is turned on and that dimensions down here is turned on. This is going to be useful information when we decide on the resolution for this print. As I mentioned before, we need to know what the native resolution is. So this has to be checked so that we see that information. Now I'm going to come down to the print job area, probably the most important area here. And you want to make sure that you're sending it to your printer. Here, right here, you see it says print resolution and it's checked. We want to uncheck this. When we uncheck this, it means that Lightroom is not interpolating the image. It is not doing anything to the image. And now we can see our native resolution. So at this size, my native resolution is 416 ppi. That means that at this size print that I'm making, which is 11 by 17 paper, but my print size is actually 9 by 13 and a half. At this size, for this image, for the information in this image, for the megapixel size of this image, my native resolution is 416 ppi. Now, if you think back to the 3-step process that I showed, printing onto my Epson, 416 is greater than the printer's native resolution, which is 360. Because it's greater, I'm going to print at double the printer's native resolution. So double the Epson's native resolution, 360, double that is 720. So now I can come down here and recheck this print resolution, and I'm going to type in here 720. And now we're going to send 720 ppi to the printer. The printer just has to divide that in half to give us a print that gives us the best quality from the file that we're sending it. Okay, and that's how this step works. First, you make sure that this is unchecked so you can see the native resolution. Then you decide whether it's less than 180. If it was less than 180 here, I would have to make my print smaller. If it's greater than 180 but equal to 360 or less, then I would set 360 here on the print resolution. And if it's more than 360, and by that I don't mean 362, 363, but if it's 375, 380 even, then I will interpolate it and send it at 720. We also have print sharpening here, and it's always useful to add a bit of print sharpening to your print so that it just makes up for a little bit of loss that's going to happen when we're printing particularly large sizes or into a matte paper. And you see here that we can choose standard, low, or high. I typically choose standard, and then media type. This depends on the type of paper that you're using. And as I mentioned before, there are basically 2 types of papers in terms of the texture or the finish, matte and non-matte, and Lightroom is calling non-matte glossy. But in this case, I'm printing onto a matte paper, so I'm going to choose matte. And this print sharpening here takes into account how much we're interpolating the image. So if we're interpolating the image by a greater amount, it'll apply a bit more sharpening. If we're interpolating by a less amount, it'll apply less sharpening. So this is going to give you better interpolation, better quality than the printer is going to be based on its built-in algorithm. And then, of course, you want to have 16-bit output checked here. If you're on a Mac, I think if it's on a Windows, I think it's automatic. I don't remember now, but on a Mac, you want to check this. That means that if your file is 16 bits, it's going to send 16 bits to the printer. Okay, then we get to the color management section. And some of you were asking here about getting your profile to show up here. So there's a couple of steps to getting your profile to show here. First step is you want to download the profile from the Canson website. So you can go to the Canson website, you go to the ICC profile section, and you select your printer, and then you can download profiles for a specific paper, or you can download the profiles for all of Canson's papers. Now, once you download that profile, you have to install it on your Mac. And I'm not going to go through that here, but there's instructions on the Canson website. You have to put it into your library folder. Inside the library folder, there's a color sync folder, and inside the color sync folder, there's a profiles folder. You put the profiles in there. When you put the profiles in that folder on your computer, that's on a Mac. By the way, on a Windows machine is a bit easier. You just double click the profile on Windows and it automatically installs it for you. But the key is that you can't have Lightroom running when you do that. If you have Lightroom running when you do that, you have to quit Lightroom, then open it back up again so that it registers that there are profiles. And then the second step is you have to come in here to the profile area, click, and you'll see here that I only have 5 or 6 profiles listed. And that's because Lightroom allows you to selectively show profiles, so you don't see every profile installed on your computer. So when you first install the profile, it's not going to be in this list. You have to click on Other at the bottom here. You select Other, and now you get a list showing all of the profiles installed on your computer. And then you see there's a little checkbox, and this checkbox tells Lightroom to actually show it inside of Lightroom. So for example, I only have a couple of profiles selected here because I'm not using these other papers right now, and so I have them unchecked. And that just makes your drop down here a little more manageable. So I'm going to print this on Arch 88. I select Arch 88, and then remember that when we did the soft proofing, we decided that we would use relative instead of perceptual because it looked a little bit better. So I'm going to select a relative here for our rendering intent. And I leave this print adjustment off because this is to make your image or your print brighter or darker, but you don't get a preview for it. And I just don't think it's necessary. I've never had to use this in order to make my prints look not acceptable, but to match pretty closely what I'm seeing on screen. Now, the last step is to set up your printer. And to do that, you click on Print Settings here on the left, and you're going to get the printer driver. So we're looking at the settings for the printer. This is going to be fairly the same whether you're on Epson or on Canon. It's going to look a little bit different based on your interface, but the ideas are the same. Make sure your printer is selected, and you can ignore all this stuff about layout and all this because Lightroom is handling all of the layout. You want to come down here to Printer Options, and you want to come down here to Printer Settings. And this is directly accessing the driver for the printer. Here's where you can set the paper source, whether you're using the sheet feeder, which is the top of the printer, or whether you're using the feeder in the front of the printer for matte papers, because on the Epson printers, matte papers have to go in through the front. Non-matte papers can go in through the top, through the sheet feeder. For Canon printers, it's the same thing, except the matte papers have to be fed from the back. And then you select your media type. The media type here is very, very important. This media type is the amount of black ink that the printer is going to use, as well as it decides whether the printer uses the matte black ink or the photo black ink. And this media type you determine from Canson's page. When you go to the Canson website and you select your printer, and then it's going to show you a list of all the profiles for your printer, it'll also tell you the media type to use for the paper based on your printer. So for an Epson printer to print on Arch, the media type that I need to use is Velvet Fine Art. Okay, that's the media type that Canson recommends you select for Epson in order to get the proper blacks and the proper ink cartridge. So it uses the matte ink cartridge. And you see here that when I select the velvet paper, it says ink matte black. Print mode here, this should be grayed out if you're selecting a profile in Lightroom. It'll be grayed out because we are controlling the color from Lightroom. We're not letting Epson control the color. And so you see here that it says color mode off, no color management. This is correct. You should never, ever let the Epson driver control the color if you are using a profile in Lightroom. Otherwise, you're going to be double profiling, which will not give you good results. So only one thing can control the color, either Lightroom or your printer. And if you're using the profile with the paper, then that's going to be Lightroom. If you're using Photoshop, it's the same thing. Photoshop controls the color. The printer should be set to off, no color management. These settings here, not so important. High speed just means that it'll print in both directions, and finest detail, I usually have this checked so that you just get, again, the best quality. Here's the output resolution, by the way. Here's our DPI setting again. This is just a function of the quality that your printer is going to print at. It has nothing to do with the PPI of our image. It basically tells the printer to use all of the available quality that it has, or in other words, all of the dots that it can produce. And so I'm going to set it to super photo, which means give me the best quality possible. Okay, that's all that means. And I hit OK, I hit save, and then here you click print. Now, one wonderful thing about Lightroom also is that when you make a print and you're happy with the results, everything worked out, everything is set the way it should be, you can then save everything I just set as a preset, but Lightroom calls it a template. If I come over here to template browser and I click the plus sign, I can save this now, and I can say 11 by 17 Arch 88. And I saved this template. This template now I can recall this template in the future with a different image, and it will not only set everything properly here in Lightroom for this paper, but it'll also set everything properly for the printer. So I don't even have to open the printer settings and go into the printer options and the printer settings. It'll set everything appropriately for me. All I need to do basically is double check that my margins are set, and that's pretty much it. So this is a huge, not only a huge time saver, but it's also a great way to make sure that your prints are consistent, because you are essentially not having to go through all those settings all over again every single time. And that limits or prevents mistakes, right? And mistakes are the thing that always crop up and can bite us. And here is the print printed onto Arch 88. Okay, and that's what it should be, how it should be looking, what it should look like. I think I trimmed the top and the bottom so that I would have a more even paper around the print itself. Let me just show you one more image, and I'll go through this very quickly. Here's another image here. And this is a black and white image. And I'm going to show you, no, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to show you the before and after. There we go. This is my original image, and this is the edited image. And so just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to achieve, I'm going for a particular look, a particular interpretation. I want to print this image onto something that it has more contrast, more depth, because I want more of the depth and dimension of the image. It's not so soft as the other one. This is a little more aggressive. I really want to project the strength of these mountains and the richness of the sky. So I'm going to go print this on a paper platine, which is a beautiful fiber-based paper that has a slight amount of, it's not texture, it just has a surface irregularity. So I'm going to take this image, I'm going to go to print. I'm going to change the paper setup and make it landscape this time. Once again, I'm going to set my margins an inch all around. Then I'm going to come down to the print job area. I'm going to uncheck print resolution to see what the native is. In this case, the native is 336 ppi. So if I'm going to print this onto Epson, I said that if it was 360 or less, you print at the printer's native resolution. So I'm going to check this and set this to 360. That's the proper resolution. Print sharpening is standard, but I'm going to set this to glossy instead of matte because this is a non-matte paper. So Lightroom considers it glossy, even though it's not really a glossy paper. Leave 16-bit output checked, and then I'm going to come down here to the profile, change the profile to Platine right here. And all of Canson's profiles start with CIFA, which stands for Canson Infinity Fine Art. Then they give you the name of the printer, P800, and then you see the name of the paper, Platine, with the weight 310. It even tells you the media setting here, premium luster. That's the media setting you need to set in the Epson driver, which we'll do in the next step. By the way, I didn't check the soft proofing because I'm pressed for time here, but I'm just going to go with perceptual for now. Finally, we come over to printer settings. We go into the Epson printer driver again. I'm going to come down to printer options, click on printer settings. And this time I'm going to change the paper source to sheet feeder because we can feed this from the top. And I'm going to change the media type to premium luster. And I don't see premium luster here. Here we go. Ultra premium photo paper luster. That's the proper media type for this paper. Once again, make sure that color mode is off. I'm going to change my upper resolution to 2880. It normally stays there. I don't know why I changed it back to 1440, but again, this is just the quality of the printer. I can leave these things checked. I'm going to hit or press or click OK, and then I'll click Save here. And once again, once we have this set up, then I can again click on the plus sign here to create a new template. This time I'm going to call this Platine 11 by 17 and hit Create. Whenever I make a new print in the future and I select this template, it'll set it up for Platine, including all the driver settings in the Epson, the media setting to premium luster, etc. Whenever I select Arch 88, it sets it to that paper with the proper media setting. So this is a huge time saver, as I mentioned before. And let's take a look at our print. Okay, and that's the print on Platine. You can see how much richer it is in terms of the blacks. And that's sort of a close-up of the beautiful texture that it has on the surface, which is not texture, but just kind of an irregularity that adds a nice depth, particularly with an image like this where I've got textural elements in the image. Also, I didn't mention this before, but when I sharpened this image, I used the sharpening in Lightroom, which allows me to, again, mask off the sky from the sharpening and preserve the sharpening on the foreground. That really makes the image have depth. It feels like the sky is behind the mountains instead of everything being sharpened the same, which makes your print less dimensional. Okay. So a few questions here, and then we will wrap it up for today. Laszlo says you can select media type on the printer's control screen. Yes, you can, but I suggest I never use the printer's control screen because all of that is overridden when you're using Lightroom. So it's just two places to check instead of without necessity, really. If you're using Photoshop or Lightroom, particularly Lightroom, you don't have to at all. You don't deal with the printer's screen at all because regardless of what's set there, Lightroom overrides everything, paper size, the whole thing. So you can control everything from Lightroom. All you have to do is put the paper in, load the paper, and you're set to go. Andrea, I had the menu you were showing in Lightroom, but since I can't read the whole thing here, let me see if I can open up this screen. I'm not sure what menu you're talking about, Andrea, but one thing I can tell you is that you have to be careful when you update drivers for your printer, because sometimes when you update the driver, um, you and you it installs the printer again, it may not actually select the Epson driver. This is something that particularly happens on the Mac, where sometimes you remove or add a printer and the printer uses the AirPrint driver instead of the actual Epson driver or the Canon driver. And if you use the AirPrint driver, that's a built-in driver on the Mac operating system, then you won't get all of the menus that come from the Epson or the Canon driver. So that's one thing I would just look into. Make sure that you are in fact using the Epson driver. You can check that by going into your printer settings and making sure that it doesn't say AirPrint. Let me see any of the questions here. I'm not sure about, someone's asking, John Paul asking about 13-inch rolls. Yeah, I don't really know in terms of the roll size. I think they are very limited in 13-inch rolls. Unfortunately, I think they start at bigger roll sizes than that. So yeah, that is unfortunate for some papers. And Elaine says, can we start from a raw picture or JPEG or a DNG? Sure. Lightroom allows you to use raw files, DNG files. DNG is a raw file. You can also use a PSD or a TIFF or a JPEG. You're going to get varying differences in quality, of course, because the raw file is going to be the most pristine quality, but you can certainly print the JPEG and do everything that I showed you with the JPEG. You're just not going to have the same adjustment, the editing potential that you have with a raw file. And yes, thanks, Jane. Paper started 17, not 13. That's what I thought, but I didn't want to say unless I was sure. Thank you, Jane. Virginia, for matte papers, you have to use fine art media type. Yes, so that has to do. So Virginia's asking, for matte papers, you have to use the fine art media type, and this reduces the size of the photo on the paper. How can you get around this? It really isn't. I don't think it's possible to get around. Matte papers on some printers require a little more margin around the paper to allow for the printer to sort of move the paper through the printer, and so they just force a larger border on you. So a lot of times you can't go like right to that 1/4 inch. So unfortunately, that's just a function of the printer itself. Generally speaking, I mean, if I need a certain print size and I'm right up against the edges, then I'll just choose the next size paper. I know that that's more expensive and it means you have to use the next paper size up, but that's a function of the printer. If you're printing on a 17-inch printer and using 17 by 22 paper and you want to get the maximum size of the image, I get it. But again, that's just a function of the printer manufacturers enforcing that sort of limit on you. You can use borderless, but then borderless is not the same, and you also lose a little bit of the image when you go borderless. So for this kind of printing where you're putting in a portfolio or you're matting and framing it, I suggest leaving 3/4 of an inch all around. You have space to sign, you have space to handle the print, you have space to mat it, particularly if you want to mat with showing the paper, over matting as it's called, and then you have some space where you can see the paper and the image itself with the mat outside. That's what I would suggest. Um, is Lightroom better than professional print and layout from Canon? So that's a question from Carlos. There is no better or worse in terms of the actual print quality. Anyone that tells you that a particular software gives you better print quality probably hasn't tried or optimized all of the different software to print. What is different is that Canon and Print Layout is just their own version of printing software in case you don't have Lightroom. So if you don't have Lightroom and you have a Canon printer, you can use the Print and Layout software. But if you're using Lightroom, I suggest you stay in Lightroom and use that. You're going to get the same quality, and you get the advantage of a unified unified interface. You can go from the import to develop to print in one application. You don't have to go outside of the application. It keeps your variables lower, and it improves your chances of being consistent. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm interested not in more tools. I'm interested in the most effective tools so that I can spend more time experimenting and being creative and exploring my creative side, not my engineering side, as it were. So this will give you the results, the quality that you're looking for. Elaine says, why do I have to use the front feeder for matte paper? Yes, it is compulsory. That's Epson's. That's a function of the mechanics of the printer and how it wants you to feed different papers. You can feed matte papers through the sheet feeder. You can. The problem is that then you won't be able to select the appropriate media type that Canson recommends. So it's one of those things where you can try it and you can see if you get the quality that you want, but you can't use the media setting like Canson recommends. And if you don't use the media setting, then you're not necessarily going to be optimizing the printer for the profile that Canson has given you. So it's one of those things where you have to kind of try and see. Does printing a 16-bit file give you more quality than ticking the 16-bit box in the printer dialogues than the 8-bit option? From Brookhart, I'm not really sure if it gives you better quality, but it's there, and I know it's going to send the 16-bit output file to the printer. And the theory is that 16 bits means that you're getting, I mean, no file is 16 bits, but even if it's 10 bits, you're getting much more information, more levels between black and white, and potentially that'll give you a better quality file. It doesn't cost you anything to tick the 16-bit box, and so I suggest you leave that on. So, you know, that option is there. I'm assuming Adobe put it there for a reason. So, Ian says, I use 3+ or A3+ to overcome fine art limitations on my Canon when I want to make an A3 print. Sure, you can experiment and try those kinds of things. But again, just be careful if you don't get the results you're looking for, or you get unexpected results because the paper isn't is not inexpensive, let's say. And one last question from Elaine. Can you please repeat where you have to load and register the ICC profile? So you download the profile from Canson's website, you install it on your computer. On the Canson website, there are instructions on how to install it on Mac or Windows. Once you install it with Lightroom not running, then you launch Lightroom. And in the print dialog, or in the printer dialog here, you come down to color management profile here on the right-hand side. Let me turn off my camera for a minute. Right here, you select profile and you select other at the bottom. And that means that now you have a chance to enable the profile that you installed in Lightroom so that you actually see it. So download it, install it on your computer, then you essentially install it in Lightroom by ticking one of these boxes. And once you tick it like that, that means that it will now show up in this drop down here. Okay, I think that wraps it up for us for today. Thank you everyone for attending and for giving me your time. I know we've run over a little bit, but there are a lot of questions and I wanted to make sure that I got through most of them. If you're interested in finding out more about my work and my workshops, you can check that out at creativepathworkshops.com. And of course, please check out Canson Paper at your local dealer. I am 100% sure that you will love the paper. As I said, I've been an ambassador for 11 years, but even if I wasn't an ambassador, I'd still be using it because regardless of how many times I try some other papers, I always come back to Canson because it just gives me the look and feel that I'm always looking for. So I can't recommend it highly enough. Thanks very much. Thanks for all the thumbs up. Appreciate it. See you next time, guys. Take care.